Welcome to the Learn at Work webinar series presented by the journal Work, a journal of prevention, assessment, and rehabilitation. We are delighted that you're with us today, and we have a very exciting presentation. Our speaker is Dr. Valerie Rice, and I'm going to have Valerie introduce herself in the next slide. So Valerie, welcome.
Hello, how are you? I'm glad to be here. In this picture, you can see Karen Jacobs on your left as you look at the screen, and I am on the right. And I have known Karen for many, many years, back when I was active duty and stationed in Massachusetts. I am a retired Army colonel, and I now do full-time research for the Army as a Department of Defense civilian. My background is I'm an occupational therapist, healthcare administrator, and also a certified human factors professional, or otherwise known as an ergonomist. All right, I'll go ahead with the talk. That's all right. Before I start, I have to say a disclaimer. The main thing is that I am not expressing the views or the position of the Department of the Army or the Department of Defense. Also, the acknowledgments are here for the research team that assisted. That's Gary Boykin, Rebecca Tree, and Angela Jetter. Also, this entire talk comes from the 2 articles that were previously published in Work. The articles are listed here, so if you want to go back to them or read them yourselves, they are listed. The title of the talk is Personal Resilience and Coping Among U.S. Military, Active Duty, and Veterans. And the authors are myself, Valerie Rice, and also Balsia Liu. We work for the Army Research Laboratory that is not part of the Army Medical Command, but is part of the Army Materiel Command. But our tenet for what we're supposed to do for our research is human factors integration research for Army medicine. We have 3 Department of Defense civilians in our laboratory, myself, Dr. Bateman, and Mr. Boykin. And then in the middle you can see the civilian contractors that work with us. So we have a nice team to do full-time research for the military. So resilience, for those of you who are not familiar with personal resilience, is the ability to withstand adversity, recover from calamity, and return to normalcy, and basically to thrive after trauma or after some large, almost catastrophic type of an event. And to do so while still recognizing how severe that situation was and is. As many of you know, active duty military are severely affected in their jobs. For example, by going to war, by seeing their peers injured, sometimes killed, by long separations from family members. And therefore, the military and we as researchers are always interested in the resilience of our troops and also of their families. But more recently, it's not just personal resilience that is of interest, but there's many talks and many articles out there on the resilience of a business or an organization, of a community, even of a country, of trying to build up that resilience. So while this talk is not on that, I will touch now and then on it. These 2 books that are shown, I'm not recommending those books in particular, but they're just examples to show you that there are books out there on resilience for an individual personally as well as for an organization. The military offers resilience training to every active duty soldier. And the topic areas I'll go through their personal health, physical, psychological, social, spiritual, and family. It also incorporates putting together a culture of trust and personal accountability, visibility of personal and unit readiness. And in that, what that means is that there is methods of checking, or there are methods of checking, both on the individual and on unit to see that they are healthy, they are ready in every way to go and do the missions that they need to do. And it's highly supported by management and management visibility as far as offering the resilience training and supporting the resilience training. Some of the topic areas in resilience training include, but not limited to, positive psychology, goal setting, motivation, and things like that. This is one of the definitions of resilience that I think is particularly useful, and that is the ability to encounter and move through significant hardship, and while continuing at that same time to function. And when I say function, for anyone who's an occupational therapist, this will sound very, very familiar in that they continue to function in all of their basic life tasks. They continue to work. They continue to interact with their friends and their family and maintain those positive relationships. And they remain involved in their leisure pursuits, their play, their rest time. Also, resilience develops over time. It's not something that you're born with and you have forever. And it's also influenced by your family, by your culture, by your experiences, and it changes over time. You could be very resilient for a certain period of your life and then be less resilient at a different time in your life. And it's related to workplace performance. When I go through this talk, I didn't want you to get on a slide and not remember something that I said previously. So there's some repetition in it. Also, I'm going to address the workplace performance throughout the talk, not just at the end. Anyway, I would say that these two individuals look quite resilient carrying on in the flood conditions. So resilient individuals, a lot of you may have heard that its ability to bounce back. In fact, there's a whole book called Bounce Back. They're adaptive, and as I said, that it is related to work performance, and that individuals who are highly resilient have higher job satisfaction and happiness at work and greater commitment to their organization or their workplace. For a organization, you can build resilience through leadership, intellectual stimulation. When it says individualized consideration, that would be things like when you have motivational factors up there that they are perhaps set for the specific individuals. So for example, not all individuals are motivated by time off. They might be also motivated by increased responsibility, or they may be motivated by awards. So knowing your people and having those individualized considerations. Also, the reward systems need to really be contingent on work performance, and that contributes to more resilience in an organization. And support all the way along from your peers all the way up to the highest management, and the culture needs to reflect that support. And their evaluations need to be on their effectiveness and their performance. And contingency plans need to be set, and people need to be aware of them. And those contingency plans would be contingencies when adverse conditions come up. Even if it's an adverse condition such as cutbacks or any kind of threat to the individual and to the organization. We used in this study what's called a resilience scale. And I'm only putting up the resilience scale so that you may understand some of the components of resilience. So the components of resilience are often considered to reflect these. So self-reliance, meaning, equanimity, and I know a lot of people are not real sure what equanimity means. And equanimity usually is referred to as being able to maintain your harmony and maintain your ability to remain calm in the face of difficulties. also perseverance, and existential aloneness. Existential aloneness is another one that's a little odd in knowing exactly what it means. But existential aloneness is often referred to coming home to yourself. So that means being comfortable with who you are, comfortable in your own skin, confident in yourself, and being okay with being who you are, not always having to identify yourself and be okay with yourself only in terms of other people, such as I'm okay with myself because I am in this organization, but being okay with yourself regardless. Coping, on the other hand, happens on a more of a day-to-day level. So coping is changing your mental and behavioral efforts to meet whatever demands are placed on you, especially demands that are challenging or might be considered beyond an individual's resources. And it changes every single day because we have different challenges every day. So it could be challenges as small as coping with your children or getting your child to their play or whatever those demands on the child are, all the way up to something very serious, death in the family, floods. So coping occurs, like I said, along that whole range of everyday problems all the way to serious trauma. Also, another difference between coping and resilience is that while resilience refers to something that's positive, a resilient individual, coping, it can be positive or negative. So positive coping mechanisms are helpful, and they're often classified as problem-focused or emotion-focused. And problem-focused coping, for example, has been associated with increased employability. But they also have negative coping. So negative coping is harmful. It makes things worse. It doesn't help one get better. And it can be denial, venting of emotions. And when I say venting of emotions, a lot of times people say, well, venting can be very positive. Well, this is the negative kind of venting, where you just can't stop talking about it. And you vent to everyone and anyone, but you never take any of the advice. So those would be harmful types of coping. Just like resilience, though, it occurs across your lifespan, changes with experience, development, culture, families, and it can change. You can have very positive coping mechanisms and then slide into the use of dysfunctional coping mechanisms. One of the nice things about coping is that it can be learned, and we're going to talk about that throughout this talk. So as I had mentioned, the relationship then between coping and resilience, and I want to make sure you understand this before I go into the research and the results, but coping refers to stressors that are small and large, daily and long-term, and it can be positive, negative, and even dysfunctional, while resilience refers to only positive adaptation in response to very serious adversity. And it signifies benefits only. So coping, as you see in the picture, would refer to another set of tools in your toolbox. You can learn to cope in more positive ways, and then that coping can influence how resilient you are as an individual. So at my work, we were thinking about coping and resilience and what they mean and how they're related to one another. And we decided that it would be very interesting to look at the relationship between coping and resilience for active duty and veteran populations. But more than that, what I really wanted to know was if you find what you consider the most resilient individuals, what kind of coping strategies do they use? And what does that tell us about the most successful individuals in a particular job, such as in the military? So that's kind of where we were going with this research. The research was conducted in the Fort Sam Houston area in San Antonio, Texas. It's also known as Military City, USA, because we have both military posts, a very large veterans hospital, and a couple of Air Force bases. We looked at demographics, as you can see listed here: age, race, gender, education, marital status, military branch, deployment history, and time in service. And time in service means how much time they spent on active duty, and if they were on active duty and left and came back, then it was the collective time on active duty. Outcome measures, as I had mentioned, we did use the resilience scale. We used the abbreviated version of the resilience scale, and I already went over the components that make that resilience scale. In the abbreviated form, though, you don't divide it into those separate categories. There is an overall score for the resilience scale, and that is said to determine a person's overall resilience. We also used what's known as the COPE, and the COPE has, again, both a longer and a shorter version, and we used the brief version. It is divided into subcategories, and all these categories that are listed here are part of it. So the three overall categories are emotion-focused coping and problem-focused coping, which are both active coping mechanisms, and then dysfunctional coping. And I'm going to go over each of those subcategories briefly so you understand what they mean. So here's some of the definitions, and it also has the work relevance in it. So emotion-focused coping is coping mechanisms that individuals use really to help quell their own emotions in response to a stressor. And it helps them to maybe redefine what's going on so that they, rather than being immediately reactive to a situation, they can be maybe responding to a situation in a more controlled manner. So the categories are acceptance, and during acceptance you accept the reality of what's happened and that you are going to need to learn to live with it and adapt to it. For emotional support, that's getting moral support and emotional support from other individuals and being able to accept it and utilize it. Humor, using laughter, using any way you can kind of not just make fun of the stressor, but even have a little bit of fun with the stressor, with the stress that has resulted, making light of it. Positive reframing is taking that view of the stressor, and even though you might have seen it as very negative to begin with, reframing it in positive terms so that those positive terms can help you move into more active problem-focused coping. And religion is using one's spiritual or religious beliefs as a source of emotional support. Again, using that support system to help you move into more active coping. And you can see on the right the work relevance for each one. Someone who uses acceptance, they can accept all the changes that are occurring in an organization or when things are not as good, and use that acceptance to help them move into an acceptable and positive way of solving problems. And the emotional support, they will turn to coworkers and seek support and offer support. And humor in the workplace, as most of you I'm sure know, the people that can use humor really lighten the workplace. Humor and laughter is a buffer against depression and stress, and it simply can make a whole situation more easy to move into, and those positives that they can identify through humor can really be strengths in a workplace. Positive reframing, I mentioned that, and again, taking something that like change. A lot of times our workers will kind of not want to move ahead with change, or especially if it's something that seems challenging and that they may have to learn something that they've not learned before. They can be resistive to it. But if it can be reframed, then they can accept it and move forward with it. So maybe the challenge is that you've introduced a new technology. Someone who could positively reframe it rather than thinking, oh my gosh, now I have to learn something new, might think to themselves, I have a whole new skill so that if I need to find a job at a different time, this will be great on my resume. That would be an example of reframing. And religious beliefs in a workplace, obviously they're not talked about in general and shared in a workplace, but it can certainly change your attitude and help you positively reinterpret things that occur so that you have individual growth in the workplace and joint support. Problem-focused coping strategies, active coping, planning, and instrumental support. So both emotional focused coping and problem focused coping are considered action coping strategies, but these really feel like they're more active. In active coping, you're taking steps. You are making taking steps, making plans, and following through to ameliorate the stressor. So to take that stress away. Planning is thinking out the method that you will then enact with active coping so that you have a really solid plan to move through and take away that stressor or to help you or other individuals cope with the stressor. And instrumental support is probably what people were saying when I mentioned before that, oh, venting can be a good thing. But rather than venting, they call it instrumental support. So you ask for help, you ask for advice from others, you may talk things over with others, but then you actually use that advice. You sift through it and put it into action. And you can see that all these would be helpful in a workplace because those who are actively coping are taking the initiative, they're moving forward. Those that plan, when they do take action, it's thoughtful action at work. They're very systematic in their approach. And for instrumental support, those who are willing to seek advice from others and perhaps make a more collective decision on something, it's only enhanced because they're not only using their own perspective, they're using the perspective of others that they work with. Dysfunctional coping strategies, I'm sure that you are aware of many of these. Denial, you just refuse to believe the stressor or the resulting stress exists. I'm sure that you've met people that you know are going through great stress, but when you ask them how they are, I'm fine, not a problem. They may not even see their own changes in their behavior as a result of the stressor. Self-distraction, they focus on other things to take their mind off the stressor. And this also can be positive and sometimes you need a little distraction, going to the movies or doing something with your family. But this is the kind of self-distraction that keeps you from looking at what the problem is and therefore keeps you from ever addressing any mechanisms to decrease the stress or to help yourself move through the stress. Substance abuse, drugs, alcohol. Some people would say that even addiction to video gaming has become both a type of self-distraction and it's not a substance, but of abuse or overuse of something. Behavioral disengagement is basically withdrawal. You stop trying to manage the stress, you stop trying to deal with things, and you withdraw from family, from support systems, even from co-workers. Self-blame is criticizing oneself and blaming oneself for what happened. In venting, I had mentioned previously, where you focus on verbalizing negative feelings and you talk about them, but you really don't do anything about them. The work relevance you can see quickly. if you deny issues, then you really can't take care of the stress. Your own stress may increase. The stress among the others you work with may increase with self-distraction. A lot of times those individuals you may find jumping from project to project, from topic to topic, because they can't focus on those things that are stressful. So when the project becomes stressful or difficult, they will begin to pull back and distract themselves with other things that they feel more comfortable with. Substance abuse, you'll see absences at work, difficulties with their performance of duty. Behavioral disengagement, they're going to separate themselves from situations that are difficult or outside their control, or if they believe that their abilities can't take care of that stressor, then they will just almost remove themselves from it and not get involved. Self-blame, they're going to blame themselves for the situation, for the resultant stress perhaps, and that blaming of themselves can be so overcoming that they cannot be productive in a workplace. They can't be productive in coming up with the solution because they're too busy focusing on themselves and blaming themselves for what is occurring. And venting at a workplace, they'll tend to consistently focus on the negative, on their dissatisfactions, and it can really distract from other people doing well because they're constantly verbalizing what's negative and what won't work. The statistics that we used in this study, we used all of these different statistical processes depending on the type of data and the type of analysis that we went into, and I won't go into each one, but I'll try to mention each one when I get to it in the rest of the presentation. We used a p-value of 0.05. So the results from the research population, and I'm going to do the results and the discussion one right after another rather than waiting and doing all of the discussion at the end. So in the demographics, if you can look at these, you'll see if you look on the right side, the totals, which may be more telling than the comparison of the active duty and the veterans. So you can see that we had almost an equal number of men and women. This is different from the active duty population, which is only about 19% women, but more female veterans came in, so that increased the number of women. Also, this research was a sub-part of another research project in which we were looking at mindfulness-based stress reduction or meditation. So we have found that women are more inclined to volunteer to be in a research study that involves something like meditation. And that may explain why we had more women than you might expect in a military population. You can see that the education level was quite high. 93% had some college or more. This also follows with some of the research that has been out in 2014 and 2015, which shows that the active duty military population tends to be more highly educated than the comparison sample of civilians. And I think this is true for several reasons. One, you can't enter the military unless you have a high school diploma or a GED, and the military also looks at the grades. So they tend to want to bring in those that have at least a 2.5 in their grades, although exceptions can be made. And also, when you're in the military, there are numerous programs that can help you get your education, both within the military. As you join, you get job training, especially if you join enlisted. So if you join enlisted, then you may be trained as an occupational therapy technician or a physical therapy technician or an infantryman. But the first thing that happens is they put you into school. And so you get that training in the military for your military occupational specialty. And then there's a lot of continuing education that is available to you, both through military training and financial support for going to college at night. Ethnicity, you can see that it's primarily Caucasian, and second African American, third Hispanic. This also follows what's published in the literature elsewhere. Only about 25% of active duty military are minorities, not including Hispanic as a minority. Marital status, this also follows what you see in the general military population, in that about 54 to 55% are married. And we had a little bit higher findings for those who are divorced than in the general military population. For military branches, this was being conducted on an Army base, so you would expect that we would have more Army personnel, which we did. 66%. And in the deployed, you can see that in comparing the active duty and the veterans, far more active duty had deployed. And this is probably because of recent events in Iraq and Afghanistan. But overall, you can also see that 60% were deployed of the total. So a little bit more on the discussion. As I mentioned, the deployment especially is probably due to the Afghanistan and Iraq. And other research has shown that 73% of active military soldiers had deployed to Afghanistan, and those who had not deployed generally were new recruits and weren't able to deploy yet. And that research showed that, as it quotes here, the Army retains very little utilized capacity to deploy active duty component soldiers. So most soldiers will deploy in their military lifetime, but especially in recent years. Other results then? For resilience, you can see on the left part of your screen, left top, active duty were more resilient than veterans. And overall, we found the results that are shown here on education, but when we then broke the analysis into active duty and veterans, these were not true for the active duty and only for the veterans. That's why it says that at the top. So you can see that there were differences in those that had a GED and those that had a master's degree and those that had a GED or a high school degree and those that had a bachelor's degree, showing that those with the lower education were less resilient. And also those who had some college had less resilience or lower resilience scores than those who had a master's or doctoral degree. Also, you can see on the bottom left part of your screen as you look at it, the more time veterans had had on active duty, the higher their resilience scores were. So in talking about that a little bit, even though those with active duty were more resilient or had higher resilience scores than the veterans, both of them fell within the moderate range. So the results were skewed to the right in that few of them fell into the lower ranges for resilience. Higher education, as many of you probably already know, is associated with psychological and physical health, possibly due to the higher socioeconomic status of those that have higher education. But it's the first time that we've seen any information on that protective effect of education, not only on health, but also on personal resilience. So that's very interesting to see, and it'd be really nice if somebody followed up with more research on that to see if that's true across the board. The fact that those who had had more time on active duty were more resilient, I really believe that this is in part due to the camaraderie that they have when they're on active duty. So while on active duty, you're with people who have had the same experiences that you have. You are in a culture that supports you. You have emotional support from peers that have gone through the same thing. And the longer time that you have on active duty, the longer time you have to integrate those experiences in a supportive culture. So I think that's why we're seeing that more time on active duty for the veterans showed higher resilience. We didn't see that with the active duty because the active duty individuals were both younger and they also had had less time on active duty. So you didn't see the same time period for them to have integrated that and to have been in that culture. Additional results for active duty service members. Younger service members used more emotional support than older service members. This is understandable if you recognize that about 70% of all of active duty service members are aged 30 or younger, and many of them are under age 25. So they come into the military right after high school, and they have been using parental support, family support, peer support. So I think that continues over when they are first in the military. Also, as you move up in time in service and in rank, you tend to lean on others for emotional support less and less, kind of going with that old saying of it's lonely at the top, because you begin to realize that you can't share that with just anyone because it can erode their confidence in you. So you can't really share that with those who are of less rank or who work for you, and you are not around that many people who are of the same rank or of the same level of responsibility. We also saw that African Americans used more religious-based coping than Hispanic participants. We didn't really delve into looking at that anymore, and I think that would be another area that would be interesting to do more research on. And it may have been just due to the individuals that volunteered to participate here, or it could be that African Americans simply are involved in more religion, but that is something that we don't know, and as I said, I would encourage people that are interested to do more research on it. We found that women use more positive reframing than men, the active duty. That means viewing stressors in more positive terms. Women do tend to use more positive reframing than men across the board. And I'll mention that on the next slide. We also found that divorce participants use more acceptance than married participants. I think that's a very interesting finding, although, again, we didn't delve into it more than that. But it may be that they've been forced to use acceptance because they've gone through a rather traumatic event in their lives that they perhaps had no control over. And so the only control they really had was their own emotional response to that situation if they couldn't change it. Then this is looking at the same data from the brief cope, but for veterans. And you can see that younger veterans really used more dysfunctional coping than the older veterans did. They used more self-distraction, substance abuse, more behavioral disengagement, and more self-blame. And the younger veterans also used less religion. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And those who had had more active duty time, as I mentioned before, more time in service, tended to use less self-distraction, less substance abuse, and less self-blame. So you can see that their coping skills were, for those who were older and those who had more active duty time, were certainly better. And those who had higher education, as we saw previously, were more highly resilient, and they used less self-blame. So this is a little more of the discussion on those. As I mentioned, females tend to use more positive reframing and less self-distraction than men across the board in other research. So I'm not sure exactly why they do that, but it may be that women tend to somewhat use more emotional responses and more control over their emotions and their reactions rather than jumping in to try and solve the situation. Um, and that may be what we're seeing. Those with a master's degree use less self-blame than any of the other categories except for GED and high school. But the trend was there for GED in high school. So it was very close to being significant, but it wasn't. And again, that may be because those who have a little more education may be able to look at things from a number of perspectives and be able to see, or perhaps have learned, that they are not to blame for many things. So and we also saw that that Army veterans tend to use less instrumental support than Air Force veterans. I've never seen a comparison of coping mechanisms between services investigated before, but I think this is probably a cultural phenomena. So for active duty Army, they may be encouraged to handle things on their own more. After all, they used to use the slogan, an army of one. And Air Force may tend to bring people together in groups for their problem solving more often. But again, that is another place for additional study. It'd be very interesting to see if the culture does determine the coping mechanisms. A little more with that, the coping strategies were pretty similar, though, between active duty and veterans. The 5 highest scores for both groups were positive and action-based. So the 3 that were emotion-focused were acceptance, positive reframing, and religion. And as I mentioned before, that for emotion-focused strategies, they're really trying to reduce their own emotional distress in a situation that they do not believe they can change. And they also used active coping and planning. So if you look at the bottom left part of your screen, that describes acceptance in a little more detailed terms. They accept reality and their inability to change it, and they tend to use acceptance when a great deal of adaptation is needed and when it's going to be long-term, when they're going to need to use something that is enduring or requires their endurance. You can see for military, this would be pretty important because they can't control a lot of things. They can't control their assignments or their work hours or who their supervisors will be, who their peers will be at work. They can't quit their jobs quickly or easily. They can't give 2 weeks notice and then just be gone. They have standard operating procedures that govern not everything that is done, but most of the things that they do, and they have centralized oversight. They have not just the oversight of their unit leaders or their immediate supervisors, but there are many levels. That supervisor has a supervisor, and that supervisor has a supervisor, and they have to pay attention, a number of layers up to what the commanding general wants, and then what their colonel wants, and then what their captain wants. So they really don't have as much control, perhaps, as their civilian counterparts. They also don't have control over their pay. They do have some control over what they do to get promoted, and what they do to get promoted has to fit within the culture of the military. Their success has to be the type of success that is defined through the military situation. They also don't control where they live, and their behavior is dictated to a certain extent in that we have Army values that become incorporated into all training that military get. They're positive values, but still they certainly have requirements on their behavior. They have to behave with respect. They have to salute. They have to just act and interact in ways that the civilian counterparts may not have to. But the other thing with that is that it's okay with this kind of acceptance for things that you can't change, because it also involves growth. So you accept that reality and the inability to change it, but that means that you have to adapt to people, to places, to the workforce. So active duty have to be very adaptable, because you can't change your peers and you can't change your supervisors. So you have to learn to get along with whoever you're assigned to. And it creates individuals that come up with more imaginative solutions that don't complain as much, because complaints don't change anything. You can complain as much as you want in the military, and it won't change anything unless you go in to try to change those standard operating procedures, or you go in and try to change the policy, because complaining won't do it. At the very bottom, it also, there was some research that was done that showed that with military that believed they had little control over their environments, they tended to use avoidance, and we did not see that with our population. And it may be because that research was done with individuals who during deployment, and our data collection was not during deployment. So the other thing that they used a lot was positive reframing. That positive reinterpretation also can be known as positive reappraisal, benefit finding, meaning making. It's very proactive. And again, they're trying to exhibit some control over a stressor simply by the way they look at it. They view it as positive or as a growth-producing situation that they're experiencing. And positive reframing is helpful, because if you turn what your perceptions into something positive, what they've shown is that positive perceptions also broaden individuals' responses, in that they will respond in many different ways, whereas if they're looking at some negatively, their perspective and their behaviors get narrower. It also builds on Fredrickson's broaden and build, which would support that idea of they're having many more ideas and actions that they can take. And they really work to hear other people's point of view, encourage team members, bolster morale, and identify unique solutions to problems. In healthcare, you see positive reframing and acceptance. They're very powerful when they're together. They predict greater function and emotional and physical well-being and higher quality of life for individuals that were diagnosed with cancer 1 year post with gynecological cancer. So these two in combination are very powerful. Religious-based coping that I had mentioned, military will use perhaps religious-based focused more than their civilian counterparts. We don't know that for certain, but in the military we have chaplains. As of 2013, we had 3,000 chaplains on active duty, representing 175 different denominations. They provide ministry, help with questions of mortality and morality, which come up frequently during military service, and also moral injury. We're finding that moral injury is an injury that occurs during wartime and underlies much of what we were considering emotional injury. So they are there. They're also the only individuals that you can talk to as an active duty person that cannot divulge any of what you said. So individuals may seek to go to their chaplains and talk with them before they'll go to a behavioral health specialist. I'm not saying that that's true, but some will make that decision. Also, prior research showed that one's religious belief prior to deployment did not predict how well they did or did not cope during deployment, but a Christian affiliation and their frequency of engagement in spiritual or religious practices did predict coping, along with their support and age. One thing with religious coping, it can be positive or negative. So positive religious-based coping, like shown here, following divorce is predictive of post-traumatic growth, but if you have negative religious-based coping, you can incur greater depression following situations such as divorce or high stress. So then their problem-focused coping that came up most often were active coping and planning. You would think they would exist at the same time, wouldn't you? Active coping and planning, how can you do one without the other? But you can. So someone who is good at planning but not good at active coping may be impulsive. They may just decide, okay, this is what I'm going to do. They may think it out, but then they jump into it. Somebody who is good at active coping but does not have good planning, they may have trouble with the execution, because their execution is immediate, but the plans were not so well laid out enough for it to be easily sequential, easily to build on one another, and they may not have considered all the implications for that plan and who it's going to affect. So again, you might think that you would see these in active duty military because planning is constant for everything you do, for recruiting to retirement. They have things planned out, they have training planned out. There's, you can think about deploying, you have to think about deploying the personnel, deploying the equipment, all the logistics for keeping things up, all the supplies that may need to go with it, putting the right people in the right place at the right time, and even sequential forecasting. So they'll be planning, 10, 20, even 30 years out. So there's a lot of planning that occurs within the military. And then once those plans are there, then the military are expected to enact them. So through policies, through procedures, through this planning sequence, it goes all the way down to those that need to be enacting it. And for military, there's not an option for inaction. I mean, you can't just do nothing. So you would expect to see some good active coping going on. These two things, the planning and the active coping, especially the active coping, are associated with positive job searches, positive performance on a job, career success, psychological well-being, but it's also associated with what's known as protean careers and boundaryless careers. And these are careers that an individual really guides themselves through their own mental prowess and abilities and decision-making, rather than by following rules and standard structures. So as I said before, planning and active coping are extremely powerful for an individual. Resilience and coping, so now we're moving into the data analysis that goes along with the resilience and coping together. So here we're looking at the highest resilience scores among active duty and veterans. And you can see on this slide that acceptance and positive reframing were used by those who were the most resilient for both active duty and veterans, but that veterans also used humor and religion. For the problem-focused coping, you can see that those who had the highest resilience scores also used active coping and planning, whereas active duty did not use any problem. Those who are the most resilient or the highest resilience scores did not use any of the problem-focused coping. And the dysfunctional strategies, you can see that these are negative correlations. So those who had the highest resilience scores for both active duty and Army used less behavioral disengagement and less self-blame. And that veterans also used less denial, less substance abuse, and less venting. So I put that all into one slide so you could see it while I made a couple of points. All of those that are in italics are true for both active duty and veterans. So the use of acceptance, positive reframing, and less behavioral disengagement and less self-blame were used by both active duty and veterans. But then you look at all of those other things that veterans are using. They're using humor, they're using religion, they're using active coping and planning. Also, they're using less denial, substance abuse, and venting. So it appears that the coping skills used by veterans is of much greater diversity than for those who are resilient and active duty. So this would tell me a couple of things. It doesn't tell me necessarily that we need to increase the number or types of coping among active duty. It tells me that those are the things that the most resilient individuals have found to be the most successful. So what it begins to tell me is that if we want our folks who are active duty to be more resilient, we need to teach them to use the particular coping mechanisms that are used by the most resilient active duty personnel, and the same with the veterans. All of this is moving towards, as you can see as I'm going through it, we started very broad and we're getting narrower and narrower and narrower with our assessments. So we took then all of the demographic information and all of the coping strategies that we had found were related to resilience. They were correlated with resilience, and we put them into a single linear regression and found that it accounted for 56% of the variance, but only positive reframing and less self-blame had a p-value of less than 0.05. That it added some, what it added to that linear regression equation was significant. So we then reran a linear regression using only those two coping mechanisms, and you can see that that accounted for 52% of the variance. And you can also see on that right side, I hope you're looking at some of these pictures on the slide. That's a really nice example of positive reframing. We stand up for life. For veterans, again, we did the same thing, using all the demographics that were correlated, plus all the coping strategies that were correlated, put them into one regression. It accounted for 60% of the variance, but only time in service, humor, and self-blame were significant, so we put them into a separate equation and found that that accounted for 45% of the variance. A little more discussion on that. I know that you know these terms already because we've gone over them, but just a little bit more with the positive
Valerie,
reframing
it's
lesson.
Karen. The webinar is going to stop in 1 minute and 38 seconds, so I'm going to need you to wrap
Okay.
up.
All
Thanks,
right.
honey.
That's okay. So these slides are there for you to see, and I'm going to go through and come down to kind of a revamp of the what I think these suggest. So we had just gone over this part. So to me, resilience training for active duty needs to incorporate the positive reframing and decrease use of self-blame, and then secondarily show that increased acceptance and less behavioral disengagement. Then you can see the same thing for the veterans, increasing the use of humor, decreasing self-blame, secondarily including those things. And maybe consider taking the individuals that have these coping mechanisms and greater resilience and put them into key positions. They may serve as role models and improve the organizational resilience. And I'd really like to see additional research on coping and resilience, because I think that what I found here, while it's true for active duty and veterans, it's going to be different for every organization, perhaps for every profession. And so knowing what the most resilient people do in those organizations or professions is going to be really helpful to helping that organization be more resilient. I've got a list of some of the presentations we've got on this topic that you can use, and we're open for any questions.
Valerie, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you, Val, do you want to type in your email in here so people can reach you, just in case we can't post their questions? But I just want to comment that I thought this was an incredible presentation. I, have read your articles, but I took notes because I think there were so many coping mechanisms that you found were important in your studies that each of us can apply to our daily lives. So I don't see anybody having posted any questions. I'm looking for those. So Valerie, next steps. What would you say in the future for research, for, all of us out in the community? What would you recommend that we do? Valerie, any comments on future research?
Yep, I've got it now. One is to look at the same kind of a relationship for different organizations or professions, because my assumption is that the most resilient people in an organization may be using different coping mechanisms. So once you know that, then you can help out the individuals in that profession or in that organization to even be more resilient and create a stronger organization or a stronger group of people that are going to come together. I think it would be fascinating also to even look at the coping mechanisms that are used by family members and also at their resilience, so that you could go to parents and help them understand what they may need to do to help create more resilient children. So I think those are two areas that I think would be really fascinating. Any other questions? I guess another one, and we are pursuing this, is we are also looking at resilience in terms of other things besides just coping. So we are looking at how much self-compassion do the most resilient people have versus those that are not resilient. We're looking at their affect. We're looking at their sleep. We're looking at their stress. So we're looking at more than just their coping, but what are all the characteristics of the most resilient people? And again, that could change by where they work and what they do. So I think that that's going to be really interesting too. And of course, we didn't look at everything. So beginning to identify those characteristics in actual research, because if you pick up a lot of the books on resilience, it's mostly anecdotal, and it comes from people that survived tragedy. I'm not saying that that's not good information, but it's not research-based. It's research-based, I guess, with quantifiable numbers rather than quantitative data versus qualitative data. And they're both important, but the vast majority of resilience information is qualitative. And so building
Val,
on
that's
quantitative would be helpful.
So Val, sorry to interrupt. We have one question that someone posted, and this is Karen Duddy out in California, and we'll do this one quickly because we'll need to conclude, and if you can advance to the last slide, that would be great. Karen wrote, if coping skills can be learned, can we teach them earlier, perhaps in high school? Maybe, I would like to suggest in middle school.
Absolutely. I think it can begin I think it can begin in preschool. Of course, they're not going to understand the nuances until middle school, but you can begin to help them, for example, not avoid an unpleasant situation or a situation that's difficult. Um, no, I'm not saying that have them deal with it in a way that an adult would, but still begin to help them move there and find out what they're doing right now. I mean, that's something we don't know. What are their coping skills? Um, I don't even know if there's a questionnaire that exists to look at the coping skills of a child.
Valerie, I don't know if there is, but that would certainly be a fabulous dissertation project.
Oh,
We
absolutely.
are going to have to conclude. Valerie, thank you. And for those of you who had some other questions, if you'd like, please send Valerie an email. Valerie, do you want to put your email in the chat box for people? And just want to thank everybody for joining Learn at Work. This is a free webinar series sponsored by the journal Work, a journal of prevention, assessment, and rehabilitation, which is published by iOS Press. If you've missed any of our previous webinars, You can listen to them at your leisure at our Learn at Work YouTube video. Please subscribe. And we have YouTube videos that will be posted. Val's will be posted so you can spread the word. And each month in 2017, we have a Learn at Work webinar. So hope to see you again soon. Valerie, thank you so very much. This was such an informative presentation, and look forward to following your research and seeing you at the next Human Factors and Ergonomic Society conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.